Sterling and Stone presents Collective Inkwell's Threshold by Sean Platt and David Wright. Narrated by Sean Platt. Threshold. Chapter 3. Scott. Clovis Point was right outside Galloway Falls, Oregon, as Davenport had said. But Galloway Falls, it turned out, was a long way from the airport. They flew into Portland, then took a small private plane to the coast, where their driver, Johnston, whisked them through the rocky headlands looming high above the sea. Sprawling vistas spilled over craggy rocks that scattered the shoreline like broken soldiers. The coast was carved with rivers and patched with forests. They turned onto one and drove for an hour. Johnston was long and lean. Didn't seem to have an ounce of fat on his body, with a face as long as the rest of him. He seemed to have a mountain of hair, but it was all stuffed up under his charcoal driver's cap. Scott could see tufts of silver locks falling out in small curled ribbons from the side. He stayed mostly quiet through the drive, opening his mouth only to remark on scenery or announce an upcoming landmark. "It's gorgeous," Hazel whispered many times while staring out the window. Johnston smiled like he painted the outside himself. "There's no place prettier than Oregon." He met their eyes in the rear view. "Not in America, and not in the world. Most folks just don't know it. Even folks from around here don't know what they're looking at, even when they're staring." "What do you mean?" Hudson asked. "Well, it's a bit of a distance from here, but take the fossil beds. Millions of years worth of history there, recorded in stone." Scott said, "What are the fossil beds?" "Fossil beds, couple counties over, all soft rocks and crumbly soil. Beds are filled with fossils, 6 to 50 million years old, back when this was a coastal plain in the tropics. Saber-toothed tigers roaming the forest and everything. Makes you wonder what sort of mysteries history's buried." Johnston fell silent for many slow forest miles after that, not saying a word until they were passing through a small downtown, about 10 minutes outside the forest. "Just a few minutes." Johnston smiled into the rear view. They left downtown and turned onto what looked like another long forest road, where Scott saw several small houses, thinly dotting both sides. Preparing for the trip had filled the Dawsons with a sort of tentative optimism. Hudson was still angry, blaming Scott for things he was already punishing himself for plenty. He wished that Hudson would blow up, lose his temper, get it over with. Instead, the house felt like the inside of a pressure cooker. Too much time spent hoping that Hudson wasn't a pipe about to burst. Following Davenport's departure, Scott sensed a brewing hope, not unlike his own, seeping out from inside Hudson. Hazel was still dreaming that her mother was visiting in her sleep to promise that all would be fine. This bothered Hudson, who thought his sister was being an attention-seeking crybaby, a label that Scott found exactly half true. He hated that something was so clearly wrong with Hazel that he could do nothing to fix. She shouldn't have to cope by making stuff up. He should be able to afford professional help. He sure as hell didn't know how to handle Hazel's claims that Holly was somehow contacting her. Was it denial? A child's way of coping with the unknown? Scott had publicly told his children that anything was possible, and that it was always good to harbor hope. But privately, he knew one of two things. Holly had either left, or Holly was dead. Hudson insisted his mother was dead, because that was easier than believing she'd left. To hear Hazel going on about Mommy being alive was too much for him. Whenever she started, he'd shout her down until she grew quiet, eventually withdrawing into her private pain and denial. Before Holly's disappearance, the family was chatty, trading stories, rumors, and jokes in bellows and whispers. Their home was rarely silent. After she went missing, loss draped their lives. It changed them, and they each found themselves settling into their own breed of silence, not quite knowing how to relate to new versions of each other. The spoke that had held them together had gone missing from their wheel. In the last few days, chatter had returned. Not a lot, and never in bursts as it once gushed, but curious questions were given voice. Out loud wondering was back. Scott hoped Davenport hadn't flown into Las Orillas with an envelope and empty promises, but even if they went back home with nothing, Scott was already grateful to see a change, a spark, in his children. It helped him to believe that more was possible, and maybe coming just past the bend. Scott was awed and confused that Holly's family had such wealth, and that she'd never shared it. As bewildered as he was, Scott felt downright slack-jawed as Johnston turned past a pair of looming iron gates, glossy and black, and drove up a perfectly curved path, what seemed like a mile-long drive, stopping at what appeared to be a sprawling garage. It wasn't a house or a mansion. It was a castle, with acres of land all around it. The sky was bright white and soft blue, the two hues smeared into a single beautiful mess. Rolling knolls were brilliant and lush. Clustered trees and flowers in patterns garnished the gorgeous grounds. The castle was a Disney attraction. Years had done little to dilute the manor's majesty. The brick had been brushed by age, but still seemed regal, with deep shades of red and clay. Walls were ornamented with mosaics and strange symbols he'd never seen. Scott couldn't count the spires, or be certain about the number of stories because of how they were stacked, but he tallied 3 gazebos and 1 endless porch, wrapping the house like an old wooden roller coaster. The garage was past the last gazebo. Johnston parked, a Jaguar XJ8L, and the Dawsons piled out. Scott started to thank the driver, wondering if he was supposed to tip. Johnston nodded toward the front porch at a pair of somethings that were probably supposed to be stone gargoyles. But they were long and lean rather than squat or Gothic. Tall like sticks, 8 feet from toe to nose and nothing but muscle. Davenport was supposed to... The driver didn't finish. The manor's double doors swung open, and the lawyer stepped outside. He passed the odd stone creatures, and took 2 steps at a time across the lawn toward them. "It's good to see you again, Mr. Dawson. Thank you for coming." Scott shook his hand, then the man turned to Hazel. "So what do you think?" She shrugged and said nothing, instead chewing her lip. "I think it's awesome." Hudson looked drunk. "How old is this place?" "Quite. It's been in your mother's family forever." Hudson shook his head. "No way." Hazel held her silence. Scott shrugged as if swatting a shiver. He looked around at the trees, gardens, and fresh white paint on the sharp-cornered gazebos. The gleam of a greenhouse sat neatly between the farthest 2. The sun was high and warmed the world below. Still, Scott felt a chill. Davenport thanked Johnston, then gestured toward the manor door. "I'm sure you're eager to discover what this is all about. I apologize for all the shadows, Mr. Dawson. But again, I can only act as the will instructs me." He smiled. "Fortunately, that's over now that you're here." He started up the back steps as Johnston carried bags from the Jag to the stairs. Scott followed with Hudson and Hazel behind him, his son uncharacteristically close. Halfway up, Scott said, "Thank you. This is all very generous." Davenport paused by the door and turned to Scott. "No need to thank me, Mr. Dawson. I've merely done as directed. Mr. Galloway was a very generous man." Hazel cried out before Davenport opened the door. Scott turned to find her standing behind them, rooted to a spot about 15 feet back. He went to Hazel, leaned down, and looked her in the eyes. "What is it, honey?" "I don't want to go in there, Daddy." He looked at her. "Why?" Because. "Because why, Hazel?" "I don't want to say." Before Scott could ask why not, "You won't believe me, and he'll make me feel bad and say I'm only trying to get attention." Hazel thrust an accusing finger at her brother. "Oh my God," he said. "Really? This crap again?" Scott turned to Hudson. "Watch your mouth." Davenport stood patiently, not wanting to rush the family's moment. "It's okay." Scott took Hazel's trembling hands. ice cold in his. "Tell me why you're scared. I want to know." "Because there was a girl." Hazel pointed to a second-story window, 2 spires over. "A girl with long blonde hair. Up there, she was staring." "So?" Scott shrugged. "Haven't you ever stared outside a window?" He laughed. "I've seen you do that, honey." "There's something about her. Something wrong." Davenport raised his eyebrows, seeming to assess her. Scott wanted to kill this quick. Hazel was seconds from tumbling down one of her irrational rabbit holes. Once at the bottom, he wouldn't be able to pull her back with 100 yards of rope. She would start going on and on about all the stuff she couldn't have seen. If that was all, he could handle it. But it was never all there was. Hazel would start with her unfounded fears, while Scott did everything to pull her from it. He would fail, watch her descend into hysterics, then deal with Hudson as he screamed, paced, and acted like a total jerk, saying things you should never say to your kid sister. Scott would allow it to happen, fearing a loss of his own control, then slowly fall asleep with the dull ache of having failed as a father. Again. If Hazel saw a girl in the window, then the girl probably lived there. He could ask Davenport, but that was risky, and there wasn't really a point. If Hazel got irrational, all bets were off. If Davenport insisted that the girl did live there, and Hazel started to scream that he was a liar anyway, which wasn't unlikely, they could lose what they'd taken 2 flights and 1 long drive to find. Scott smiled, still kneeling. "It's okay, sweetie. We're safe. And together. We have to go inside if we want to hear what Mr. Davenport wants to tell us. Aren't you curious?" "Not enough to go inside." "Will you go inside for me?" Scott squeezed her hand tighter. "Okay, Dad." Hazel stepped toward the door. Davenport smiled at the Dawsons, then turned the knob. Scott stood and glanced back at the window to where the girl was supposed to have been standing. He saw only cream-colored curtains, but felt his daughter's chill. She took his hand, and together they entered the manor. You've been listening to Threshold by Sean Platt and David Wright. To see all the books in the Sterling & Stone catalog, please visit sterlingandstone.net. To help decide what we read next, please visit sterlingandstone.net/indie fiction podcast. See you next time.